Alright, so this graph summarizes the results from a study targeting the number of problem behaviors exhibited by a student and the percentage of academic engaged time. This is a multiple baseline design, and you can tell it's a multiple baseline design because of the stacked presentation. And by stacked, I mean you've essentially got two graphs here. You've got one on top, and then you've got one on bottom. And you can see that the implementation of the intervention was staggered because of this little group of elbows right here. Now, there are a couple things that are important to know when you're looking at a graph from a single subject design study. So first, let's look on the far left-hand side. On the far left-hand side, you can see that the axis goes from 0 to 10, and that's true for both graphs. And this shows the number of problem behaviors. And when you look over on the far right-hand side, you can see that the axis goes from 0 to 100. And this represents the percent of academic engagement. So this study is looking at two separate dependent variables, or two separate variables that are being measured during the study. Now let's look at the top tier of this graph. Now there are two different sets of circles represented. You've got open circles, and then you've got closed circles. The open circles correspond to the percent of academic engagement shown by the student, and then the closed circles correspond to the number of problem behaviors exhibited by the student. Then also, you can tell what condition these scores fall in. So on the far left-hand side, we're looking at the top tier, the very top of the top tier. The left-hand side is the baseline condition. The baseline is the scores that are derived prior to the implementation of an intervention. And then you can see on the right-hand side of the top tier, this area right here represents the intervention condition. And the two phases are separated by this black line. So when you go to interpret the results from a single subject design, there are two steps to your interpretation. First, I'm going to write my notes down here on the bottom. First, you examine the data within conditions, and then two, you examine the data between conditions. And in both instances, you're going to be looking at the stability of the data and the trend of the data. So now let's move on to the actual interpretation. So remember, first we're going to look within. And we're just going to focus on this top tier And first we're going to look at the baseline condition. So everything we talk about in regards to interpreting baseline data are also applied to interpreting the intervention data. And we're just going to focus on the academic engagement scores. Once again, everything that corresponds to interpreting academic engagement scores is also pertinent to interpreting the number of problem behaviors. First, we're going to look at stability. Stability takes a look at how much difference is there between these scores. Like, you can think of that as interpreting up and down. Now, looking at these baseline scores, you can see that there's not a whole lot of difference between the last score and the first score. They're all right within the range of, it looks like, about 7.5 to 8. So if you were to draw a line that tried to touch as many of those scores as possible, or be as close to the scores as possible, it'd roughly be, it wouldn't be that, it would roughly be about there. And all those scores pretty much fall along that line. So you can say that the academic engagement scores do have a pretty high degree of stability. Now, the next thing you take a look at is you look at the trend of those scores. And by trend, we mean what direction is the student's performance moving towards. Now, trend can be down here in the bottom white space. Trend can be flat. Trend can be accelerating or improving, or trend can be decelerating or deteriorating. So when we look at the trend of the academic engaged scores, if you again were to draw a line to try and connect the first score to the last score, you would essentially have a straight line. So in general, it would be safe to say that the academic engagement scores in the baseline condition show a flat trend. So we know that the scores in the academic engagement scores in the baseline condition show a high degree of stability and also a flat trend. So now that we've examined those scores within condition, we need to take a look at scores between conditions. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to take a look at the amount of difference between the last score of baseline and the first score of the intervention. Now you can see that there is a clear separation between these two scores. So what that means is it indicates that the intervention was immediately impactful for improving the student's academic engagement. Now we're going to take a look at the entire data set within the intervention condition. And again, if you were to draw that line, it pretty much fall a little bit lower than that. It would pretty much fall right about there. And remember, our line for the baseline would have been pretty much there. So not only was there a immediate difference between intervention and baseline, there was also a consistent difference between intervention and baseline. Now let's take a look at the trend of the academic engagement scores. You can see that this is also likely a flat trend. If you were to connect these two, your line would essentially be pretty flat. Now part of this is just a product of the variable being measured. So there was such a substantial improvement that the students' academic or percentage of academic engagement went from about 75% to consistently above 90%. So the student's trend could not go upwards just because there's a ceiling placed on the amount of placed on the percentage of academic engagement the student can show. You can't be more engaged than 100% of the time. Now remember, what we just talked about in terms of within condition and between condition comparisons of stability and trend correspond not just to the top tier, but also to the bottom tier.